Okay, and we're off to the races. So welcome back to SD 555, our intermediate system dynamics modeling course. And let me share my screen. Let's get right to it and pull up our dynamic syllabus here. Just real quickly, how we doing here? We looked at the standard method. This issue of reference modes. Remember, we model problems from a systems perspective. We don't try to model the system. We don't try to make a digital twin. So then that gets into, well, how do you do that? Well, we make a problem statement, turn it into a dynamic picture called the reference mode, as we all know. And we talked about some more sophisticated aspects of doing that, right? Like detrending data. And later on, the base run of the model should mimic the reference mode. If it's data-driven, numerical time series data-driven, we haven't talked about how you fit it to the data yet. We'll talk about that later in the course. But we did say, how would you know if the model is mimicking, the base run of the model is mimicking the reference mode? And we talked about the tile stats. And we also talked about, a scoring metric. And in some sense, the scoring metric could almost be a reference mode. And I haven't ever seen anybody sort of posit that. The scoring metric is kind of an afterthought, but one could argue that a multi-attribute scoring function should be the reference mode, that there's a whole bunch of things happening here. And when you smear them together into a score, it's the score is doing whatever it's doing over time. And if the score is going down, that's bad. So I don't know. That's a research question. Should a reference mode be a multi-attribute scoring metric, or should it just be a series of time series graphs, and the model should mimic that? So it's in some sense disaggregated versus aggregated. I'm open to the notion that it doesn't matter as well. It's two ways of getting to the same place. But certainly for a game, when we turn these things into games, this is important to get a scoring metric. So we covered that, right? We talked about different ways of doing it, and I showed 3 different ways, and we compared them and what have you. Once we have a problem statement and its dynamic representation with a reference mode, we said, now we start conceptualizing. What is causing this problematic behavior, right? And we got into using the social fabric matrix. We talked about getting AI to help us, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. The hexagon method, what if you have a bunch of people in the room that know a lot about it? How do you extract their information? The hexagon method is one way. We can do a whole course on group model building, which is beyond the scope of this course, but there were 2 groups in the system dynamics world who primarily did research into group model building. So the idea being, you're the modeler, and you know a lot about something or other, a domain area or 2, but you can't know every domain area, right? So you're brought in as a modeler, and you don't really know the domain area. You have to rely on others to tell you what's going on, to help you conceptualize the model, what's important, what's not, how things work, and what have you. And you get into how do you effectively extract that information from people, number 1, and then number 2, use the modeling process to help the experts and stakeholders reach a consensus, agree that the model, yes, we're all saying that this is our model, not Mike's model or Ashley's model or Najal's model or Ennis's model. It's the group of experts model. The modeler was just the middleman or the middle woman who took what they knew and put their knowledge into the computer. But it's their model. They have ownership of it. They agree with it. And then when they run scenarios, it's hard for somebody to object, right? Because it's their stuff is in there. Now, sometimes you get into a thing where 2 people just don't agree. No matter what, they don't agree. Then you have to start saying, all right, let's go through the model. How about over here? Do we all agree? Okay, we all agree. No issue. We move on. How about over here? Do we all agree? Nobody disagrees. We move on. And you can kind of find where in the model is there disagreement. Because usually people, you're you're born, you're an infant, you're a middle schooler, you're a high schooler, you're a college student, you're in the workforce, you get old, you pass away. Who disagrees with that? Hearing nobody, we'll leave that alone. That's okay. We move on. And, you can find that most of the people will agree with most of the stuff in a model. And if there's disagreement, you can kind of narrow it down. And if you can't resolve it, you just run the model 2 ways every time, Johnny's way and Sally's way. And guess what? It often doesn't matter. It's not a leverage point. So why are we quibbling? But anyway, there's 2 groups that did research into how you do all that in a scientifically valid way and in a teachable, repeatable way. And one group was at SUNY Albany. Okay. They were a big system dynamics power for a long time. Why? Because George Richardson and David Anderson were both there. They're big shot system dynamicists. And number 1 and number 2, David Anderson was the dean. So good to have the big guy on your side, right? The dean. So they trained a lot of doctoral students over the years and what have you, but they're both retired now. So I don't know that they're a big group model building shop anymore, but they did a lot of work historically on how to do group model building properly. And being at the Rockefeller School of Public Affairs at Albany, they were literally, I haven't been there recently, but my memory was 3 or 4 blocks from the state capitol. So they would do a lot of work with the state government of New York, testing their ways of doing group model building. The other group was Jack Vennick's group in the Netherlands. And I think Jack was at Nijmegen University. I think we were there. Over the years, I've been to so many of these places that they blur together, but I believe he was at Nijmegen. But Jack has sadly passed away. So again, he has a book on the topic, but so I don't know present day who's doing research into group model building. I do know the people at Washington University at St. Louis are doing a lot with community system dynamics modeling. That's similar, but it's different. That is, you go out into the community and talk to people. You talk to the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker to find out what's going on in like a town setting or something. That's not quite the same thing as putting a bunch of executives or government officials or military officers, intelligence analysts or whatever in a conference room and having them chit chat, agree, disagree, whatever. But again, it's the idea being you're the modeler, you're the conduit, you're the middleman, the middlewoman, and it's their model, not yours. You're just trying to find out what's going on. So that's a whole area of conceptualization that we're really not going to cover in here. And we need to, at WPI, create a course in all of that. So any volunteers? Don't all rush forward at the same time to volunteer. But you get the idea. There's some of this stuff that we either used to teach and don't anymore, or we never taught it, and we should. One of the problems is getting a definition of what should a system dynamics modeler know. Well, stocks, flows, feedback. Okay, we don't know that, but what other stuff? And there's never been like a agreed upon curriculum. That's good and bad. It's bad because there's no agreed upon curriculum. It's good because we can do whatever the hell we want. So anyway, so once you are all PhDs, maybe you'll decide you want to do a course in group model building or some of the other places where I think we have holes in our game at WPI. But all right, so anyway, so that's a diatribe on conceptualization. We talked a little bit about sort of doing it on our own with the social fabric matrix or maybe hexagon method with some people, but there's this whole other group model building thing that is beyond the scope of the course. We talked a little bit about aggregation and getting that just right. And as you're going to see in a little bit here when we talk about delays and things, that's also a very important, this aggregation concept is going to raise its head again and again and again. Okay, so where we're kicking off then is molecules, assemblies, archetypes, and generic structures. Okay, so that's kind of a mouthful of stuff there. Okay. And if after we talk about that, we're going to start actually looking at molecules, assemblies, archetypes, and generic structures. And we're going to look at a whole lot of them, because what we want to do is make sure that we have an arsenal of stock flow feedback loop structure that others have developed over the many, I'll say years, decades. And we know under what circumstances these chunks of stock flow feedback loop structure work well, where they don't work well. And we don't want to be reinventing the wheel all the time, right? So one way of thinking about system dynamics software, or the icons, the concepts embodied in system dynamics software, is that they are sort of Lego pieces or Tinker Toy pieces or erector set pieces. I don't know what the kids play with now, but stuff where there's these generic pieces, you can build them into anything you want, right? So the Lego pieces might be the best. Everybody's familiar with these things, but you can assemble them in all different ways. So that's sort of what we mean by molecules and whatever archetypes, generic structures, assemblies, is that these are chunks of Legos, of stock flow feedback loops structure that we can reuse in all different ways. So we want to become familiar with them. By the way, did I ever tell you the Lego story? System dynamics and Legos, did I ever mention that? I don't want to repeat my stories. I did or I didn't?
I don't remember it.
Okay, real quick. So I was summoned some years ago to the Lego company. And they have a big office, or they had, I assume they still do, I don't know, office in Connecticut. So they have a problem. Can I come down and talk to them about possibly using system dynamics? So, okay. So down I go. And it was crazy. You like, again, at the time, you walked into their lobby of their building and they had like a giant Lego US Capitol and a giant Lego Eiffel Tower and stuff, like giant, like huge, I'm like, oh, that's pretty wild, pretty cool, a little different. And so I spent the day there talking to their managers about what their problem was. So guess what their problem was? Any want to venture a guess? Why does Lego need system dynamics? I ended up telling them, you probably don't need me, at least at first pass, and I directed them elsewhere. But what was their problem? You have any idea what the Lego people, how can this possibly be a problem? The only problem with Lego is if you step on one with bare feet. That's a problem. Go through the friggin' ceiling. So go ahead. What?
Is it to decide the ideal way to build the Lego sets to maximize profits?
Okay, good. That's not a bad guess. The problem was this, that the culture in Lego among the employees was that we build the finest toy known to humankind. We always have, and we always will. So, but Legos were losing market share to knockoffs, to similar but more cheaply made versions of Lego, slightly different to, so they don't get sued, but very cheaply made. Like if you ever picked up a Lego, you need a hammer to crush the thing, right? Because it's just a very well made toy. And some of the other stuff are kind of, you could step on them with your shoe and smash them to smithereens. What was happening was Grandpa and Grandma would go to buy Johnny or Sally Legos for like a birthday gift, and they'd say, they're going to play with this thing 5 times and that's it. So I'm not buying the really expensive, well-made Legos. I'm just going to get them the cheapo stuff because they're not going to play with it very much. So they were losing market share. So the management of Legos said to their employees, hey, we got to make a cheaper, crappier version to compete. But the Lego culture was so strong, the employees cannot bring themselves to make an inferior product. So what should they do about that? That was the product. And it was interesting. I went, talked to all the managers, and every manager had Lego crap on his or her desk, and they were like playing with them while we're talking. Like a stress ball or something. And I asked one guy, what do you do around here? So that's what Jay would always ask. What are you doing around here? And he goes, I invent new Lego pieces. And I'm like, ha, 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 ha. He goes, no, really, I do. That's your job. Yeah. His job was to sit around thinking about new pieces of Lego to make. So it's a kind of a different kind of job, you know. Anyway, I said, you know, you really need some focus group stuff before you bring in a system dynamicist. So I said, do that and then call me if you need me after that. And they never called. So I don't know. Don't know whatever happened. But anyway, so we almost had a Lego thing going at with system dynamics. But anyway, okay, back we go. So what is the deal with molecules, assemblies, whatever, and so forth? So let me first go to some PowerPoint slides here and remind everybody about, this is at least the way I think about things. And I'm not saying it's the best ever in the world, but it's the way I think about this. So you might remember, I think I did this in the first course, I talked about my eureka moment where I figured out how system dynamics and economics can blend together, right? Where up to that point in time, the economists and the SDers were fighting and they hated one another and they were sniping at each other in the journals and all that stuff. And I concluded that the system dynamicists didn't realize that economists categorize themselves or self-organize themselves into schools of thought. And in the different schools of thought, they do economics differently. Every economist doesn't do economics the same way. And it turns out that heterodox economists do economics in a way that perfectly matches system dynamics. So the system dynamics people and Jay at the time were just talking to the wrong kinds of economists. They're talking to economists in the wrong schools of thought. So anyway, I don't want to get into that whole story, but this is just sort of the ta-da part of my discovery, insight, or whatever, that heterodox economists do pattern modeling. Have I covered this? I don't want to belabor stuff that I've previously covered. I talk about this stuff a lot, so I can't remember who I told it to. Is this familiar to you guys or not? If it's not, I'll proceed. Otherwise, I'll just have you remember this. I'll go through it. So hearing silence. So anyway, so pattern modeling is an inductive process. So it's like a physician trying to diagnose a patient's illness or a detective at a crime scene trying to figure out what happened, right? It's basically the Harvard case study method. You're starting from the real world and then using inductive logic to find patterns and build your way up to principles or theory. The opposite way of doing science is using deductive logic and starting with theory and then deriving testable hypotheses and then looking at the real world. So theory first, real world second, and that's how orthodox economists do science. And the heterodox economists start with the real world first, identify patterns, and build their way up to principles or theory. So it's Rene Descartes versus David Hume, if you want to talk about the ancient philosophers who figured all this out. So the heterodox economists, they do pattern modeling. They look for clues, and the clues are called themes. Okay, so it would be like a physician looking at a sick patient's symptoms, or a detective at a crime scene looking for fibers or lipstick or a handkerchief or, you know, whatever you look at a crime scene, right? And you're trying to take these themes, these clues, these symptoms, and assemble them together into a story or a coherent whole. Okay, so you're really using a systems approach. It's like assembling a jigsaw puzzle, right? You got the pieces scattered all over the place and you're trying to figure out what happened, what's ailing the patient or whatever. So you're connecting the clues, the symptoms, whatever, into an explanation, a pattern, okay? Of course, we do the exact same thing in system dynamics. We don't call it pattern modeling, but we're looking for variables that are important, right? Using the hexagon method or whatever. And of course, we obviously use a systems approach. But a detective doesn't arrive at a crime scene, like a homicide detective doesn't arrive at a crime scene, a murder scene, with devoid of any knowledge, right? They come armed with, they're called real typologies or regularities among different patterns. So over time, after at many crime scenes, you find regularities, and those are called real typologies. System dynamics, we call those generic structures, okay? And so you come, if you're a homicide detective, you're familiar with other crime scenes, the similarities. And if you're a physician, you're familiar with other patients who have had the same symptoms, right? And then if there are regularities among the real types, those are underlying principles, like the principles of economics. And that would be, if you want to think of it as, medical school would be the principles. And then the specialization in cardiology. And then the pattern would be, I have a patient who's having heart trouble, right? Or you have, the principles would be the law and law enforcement techniques. Then if you're a homicide detective, the real types would be you study different homicide scenes, and then you're confronted with the next crime scene, right? So you use the principles and the real types to help guide your next pattern model, your next assembly of the clues. So a physician relies on medical training and other patients who have had similar symptoms to try and figure out what's going on, et cetera, right? So but the pattern model traditionally is non-mathematical. It's a case study, like a Harvard case study, okay? And just to complete the discussion here, the economists who are in the schools of thought that do this say that the most important underlying principle is circular and cumulative causation. Okay, and that was Gunnar Myrdal won the Nobel Prize in economics for applying that concept to developing nations. Okay, and more recently, they do stock flow consistent modeling. Sounds a lot like system dynamics, right? These economists in these schools of thought never heard of system dynamics. They were essentially doing the same thing. So I told Forrester, you got to talk to the right economists. You got to go, to economists in the right schools of thought, and they will love system dynamics, right? And then I told the economists in those schools of thought that did case studies but didn't build mathematical models, because they did at that time, the math they didn't think could adequately represent the whole narrative, the whole tapestry of a pattern. Hey, there's a way to mathematize and make rigorous what you do. Okay. So anyway, that's the background. I discovered that, and I talked to Jay about that, and he accepted it, and he fight the economists with this and whatever. So why do I tell you that? Well, I always refer back to this diagram that I've created here, particularly when we're talking about generic structures and things. Okay. So there are two levels here. There's principles, and then there's the real types or the generic structures. And I've kind of said that the talk now is about generic structures, but there's a reason I'm showing you this. And what we get into is a lot of times when you have terminology, people use the same terms for different things, and it can be confusing. So if we talk about principles, and now principles in system dynamics, not in economics per se. Okay, principles of systems, what do we mean? Well, if you look in the literature in system dynamics, that phrase, principles of systems, is often intertwined in different areas. So it could be principles of actual systems, right? And in the first course, we covered the characteristics of complex systems, okay? Or principles of system dynamics modeling, which is how do you do the modeling, technically, right? And there are some people who use the phrase to represent links between structure and behavior. Hey, this collection of stock flow feedback loop equations generates this behavior. So if you see this behavior, you know it has to be generated by this collection of stock flow feedback loop structure. Okay, so that's kind of like a generic structure, right? So if you want to know more about this, this is where I said a little bit earlier today, if you're going to cast your lot in the field of system dynamics, you want to start acquiring a lot of the famous books and things, because it's very useful to be able to refer to them. So Forrester wrote a book called Principles of Systems, okay? And it's mostly about principles of system dynamics modeling. Okay, he does have some other stuff in there, but that's principally what it's about. On the other hand, Sturman's book has a list of systems principles, and this collected papers by the Meadowses, which has a paper by Jay in it. They talk about the characteristics or the principles of actual systems. Okay, and then over here, Alan Graham's, it's hard to read his signature, but he's a famous SD guy. He wrote a doctoral dissertation where he looked at principles related to the structure and behavior of oscillating systems. So you got to keep, when we say, you know, principles of systems up here, what are we talking about? Or what is another system dynamicist talking about? A real system, system dynamics modeling, or structure and behavior that always happen or happen routinely. Okay. So I've kind of said we're going to be playing down here at generic structures, but I also mentioned archetypes. I don't know for sure, but I think the archetypes are up here, not down here. So we'll have to see as we go along. And I'm interested in as doctoral students, in your opinions on this stuff as we go along, because I don't know that I have the answer. I'm sometimes you're struggling, you know, you're developing new concepts here, and it's like, let me run this by other people. So I'm all ears if you have feedback as we go along here. Okay, so having said that, let me pull up another set of slides. This is which one? This one. So I'm kind of popping in and out of slides. So in another deck of slides, I say, well, we're going to look at this area here. These are the generic structures. Okay, so it depends on the level, how high up in this sort of chain of logic you go, right? And if you read the papers related to that literally say generic structures in them, okay, you start, again, there's not a lot of agreement in the field as to exactly what is meant by these things. But you'll see David Lane, he's a British guy, system dynamics guy. He makes the point in one of his papers, I'll pull it up here in a minute, that, hey, this phrase, generic structures, is used so widely, we better be able to define it. Everybody says it, but nobody can define it. So the first paper that was written about the topic of generic structures explicitly, it says it in the title, was by Mark Paich. Mark sadly died maybe a year ago or so, or maybe not even a year ago. But it appeared in the very first issue of the System Dynamics Review in 1985. Okay, and what he says is that, well, there's sort of two ways to think about a generic structure. Okay, feedback structures that are transferable to new situations within a particular field. So like the urban dynamics model, it's of a city, but it could be Chicago or New York or Tokyo or London or Paris or whatever, if you parameterize it and modify it appropriately. And another example would be Jack Homer's model of the diffusion of new medical technologies into the marketplace. He did it for the, if you remember, I would cover this in the first course, the drug or the antibiotic, excuse me, clindamycin, and cardiac pacemakers. So basically, clindamycin is both a pill and an ointment, an antibiotic like Neosporin kind of. And then a cardiac pacemaker is a physical medical device. And his model could explain the data for the adoption and diffusion of those two very different technologies with just five changes to the model. It's a very big model, very different time shapes. Okay. Or Page says another way to think of a generic structure is that they're feedback structures that are transferable across fields. Okay. And this, I think, is where you get into your molecules and assemblies. So Stella calls them assemblies. Vensim calls them molecules. They're essentially the same thing. Okay. Different terminology we want to be aware of, right? And then Barry Richmond, who created Stella, but has passed away, and his family no longer owns the company. Different people own it. The people who own Stella now call them assemblies, but Barry, who started Stella, called them atoms. So sometimes you see them referred to as atoms of structure, or molecules are now assemblies. Okay. And then there's these archetype things. And the archetypes became famous because of Peter Senge. So has everybody heard of Peter Senge? Anybody know who Peter is? Is that a common name or to you, or a uncommon name? Does anybody know? Okay.
I don't think so.
All right. So Peter is a very famous SD guy. Let's see if I Google it, what am I going to see? Yeah, so Peter comes up. Here's Peter right here. It's funny, Peter lives a mile from me, and I never see him except like in Europe. I'll see him in Germany. I'll be like, why don't I see you at Dunkin' Donuts in the center of town or at the post office? His house, I live like a mile from our town beach, and his property abuts the town beach. So when you're sitting on our town beach and you look to your left, you see his fence. And you think he'd be on his dock or something or whatever. Never see the guy. Anyway, he's a good guy. He wrote a very famous book in 1993, I think it was, called The Fifth Discipline. He has a lot of videos and stuff now. What does it say about Peter here? What he did with The Fifth Discipline was kind of document and present to the world, the business community really, in plain language, plain English, a lot of the stuff that was done in the system dynamics group at MIT since its beginning. But unless you went there and hung around with those people, you never knew about it because it wasn't really written up or published or anything. So, for example, the beer game was described by Peter. Everybody's heard of the beer game? I think we discussed it. So it had been played since 1960 at MIT, but unless you went there or happened to come across it somehow, you never heard of it. Well, Peter described it in his book, and suddenly everybody wanted the beer game played. So they were looking for facilitators. I think I might have mentioned to you, I was flying all over the world, like every month, facilitating beer games. And it was always C-suite executives at resorts. So I did it, Marco Island, Florida. I did it at a castle in Glasgow, Scotland. I did it at Lake Geneva for Caterpillar equipment, and everything I was saying was translated right afterwards into Portuguese because it was their Brazilian distributors. Park City, Utah at a ski resort. And I needed helpers. So I brought WPI students along to help me watch the game boards. Where else we go? San Diego, Arizona, somewhere, Columbus, Ohio. We were everywhere doing this thing because of Peter's book. Everybody read it in his book, and everybody suddenly wanted it. Well, he also popularized the archetypes in the book. So everybody's using archetypes now. Okay. So you got to be aware of the archetypes. They're out there and whatever. Now, here's the thing. The archetypes, I believe, and let's go back here to the syllabus. Here's the archetypes down here. A lot of the archetypes are the characteristics of complex systems. Remember I said, and I hope I'm not confusing everybody here. I'm trying desperately not to, but it's very hard to try and organize this stuff. You know, when I say principles of systems here, which, you know, of actual systems, of system dynamics modeling, or structure and behavior, and the characteristics of actual systems, those principles, a lot of them are the archetypes. So maybe the archetypes should be up here, not down here with the generic structures. That's where I don't expect you to tell me now, but that's something to think of. I'd be interested as you study this, hearing your opinion as to, do the archetypes belong at the principles level or down at the generic structure level? And I don't know what the answer is for that. Okay. So let me get out there. So let me quickly show you. I guess it's this one here. A little bit more about these things. So the molecules are presented, if you will, by Ventana Systems in Vensim, the other big system dynamics modeling tool. There are many, but the two biggies are Stella and Vensim. PowerSim kind of comes in third, and then people like Kim Warren have their own. Other people have their own. There are people doing system dynamics with R. There are people doing system dynamics with Python. There are dudes running around doing it in Excel. So, you know, but the two biggies are Vensim and Stella, right? So the Vensim calls them molecules, and this is a screenshot, right? But in the real software, you can click on these things, and it'll take you right to the generic structure, the equations, the stock flow feedback loop structure and equations, and it'll tell you, here's where you use it, how you use it, whatever, and you can copy and paste it right into your model. You don't have to reinvent it, right? And if you were to go to Stella, we got other stuff going on here that maybe we'll get to today. I hope so. Maybe. Let's see. If you go to the assemblies panel, okay, it's the same thing. It doesn't have this nice picture, but it'll take you to, you know, if you want an aging chain, here we go, right? Add to model. Okay. There it is. I didn't have to, you know, and it's got all the equations are there, right? So I could have stared at my screen and invented this, or I could have said, I need something like this at this part in the model. Is there a molecule, an atom, an assembly, a generic structure, again, the terminology that I can use? Has somebody already done this? And I might have to modify it to fit my circumstances, but I don't want to stare at a blank piece of electronic paper if somebody's already done it, right? So becoming familiar with molecules, assemblies, and what have you is a very good thing, right? It can save you a whole lot of time. Now, you don't want to just do this willy-nilly, like, oh, it looks close enough, throw it in and run it, right? You know, you got to say, okay, this might just be a starting point. I might have to modify things significantly here, but at least I got something going here. Or if sometimes it's just, hey, this is exactly what I need, boom, I move on. It just depends. And obviously, the more you become familiar with these things, the less you have to test them and examine them because you're already familiar with them, right? So studying and learning molecules, atoms, archetypes, generic structures, assemblies is going to be super helpful in learning how to model. It'll save you time, but also you can study these things and say, all right, well-known veteran modelers have already invented this. What did they do here? Let me study it. Let me look at the equations. Let me run it. Let me run it with different test inputs. Let me see what's going on here. And you go, aha, I see what they did. Very clever. I can use that. Or I can't use it now, but I may be able to use it later. I'll remember it for later. Okay. All right, so this is the Vensim version, and a lot of these are both in Stella and Vensim, and Suleiman Ba, one of our recent graduates, PhDs, he graduated in May. What he's working on, what I got him doing, is going to behavioral economics and saying, what do the behavioral economists do, and can we replicate their stuff in system dynamics, because they don't use system dynamics in that area of economics. But can we replicate their stuff and then figure out how to put it into our models? So we have good, grounded psychological decision-making structures that can stand up to scrutiny from a behavioral economist or a psychologist. They've been tested with human subjects and what have you. And we put them into our models. And can we begin assembling a list of new molecules that come from psychology and behavioral economics that don't exist? So you can invent new molecules, is what I'm saying, or assemble. Okay. All right. So there's a snapshot of some assemblies. Okay. Now, in the first course, you might recall, we went through 3 molecules, right? A first order positive loop, first order negative loop with a implied goal of 0, and a first order negative loop with an explicit goal, right? If you remember that. And we kind of pulled them together. We built an arms race model and a bunch of things, right? So let me pause and say, you remember that from the first course, right? More or less, right? And I'm guessing Call It in 551 was kind of drawing on some of that stuff, or at least you should have recognized those molecules if they appeared. If it's a new molecule you've never seen before, there's no need to recognize it. But if it's one you've already studied, you should. One of the skills is, aha, I see over here, that's molecule number 2 from SD 550, right? I studied that molecule. I ran some simulations and looked at half-life and doubling time and, and all that stuff, right? Okay. Is that fair to say? I'm pausing here. You're probably not going to admit it's unfair to me, so.
Yeah,
All right.
I think that's what I certainly try to do when we build a model in college class, is to try to recognize an existing structure I've seen before.
Okay,
I
good.
can't always say I'm successful.
Right.
But that's always the.
Yeah, nobody knows everything about everything, so we're always learning, including Mike Radzicki. But the idea is, how do I go about my business? How do I go about learning to do this stuff? And so one way is to be, first of all, aware that there are these things that the phraseology, the terminology in the field is, sometimes atoms used to be a more, and now it's, since Barry's gone and Ayers sold the company, that atoms, the phrase atoms, or the term atom, the word atom, is really not used any much anymore. But molecules, archetypes, generic structures, and now assemblies are used a lot. You go to the SD conference, everybody's talking, so you got to be aware of what these terms mean, number one. And then number two, everybody's talking about them. There must be some reason, right? Well, because we use these things all the time, right? So, okay, how do I learn them, or where do I get them, or what, so then you got to start just little by little studying these things. And you probably, studying all of them just for the sake of studying all of them is like reading the dictionary. Go ahead. Reading the phone book. So that's not necessarily the best way to go about it. Probably it's on a as-need basis. So you're building a model of something and you're saying, okay, how do I make the thing do this? You should say, is there a molecule, an assembly, a generic structure, whatever, that I can find where somebody's already done it, and I can use that. You don't want to claim you invented it. You give the person credit, whoever did it. But if it's in the public domain, you're free to use it. Just cite them. Okay. All right. So we talked about all this stuff. So I don't know if I have the archetypes in here. Let me blow through this. This is from the first. Okay. So the archetypes. Okay. So let me say a few words about the archetypes. And we're going to look at some of the papers and things. And depending on our time here, we'll actually start examining generic structures. Some you haven't seen before. So Peter, in his book, sort of organized the archetypes, and they're usually presented with causal loop diagrams. Now there is a well-known system dynamics guy named Gene Ballinger, and I think Suzanne, I wish she was here. I think she knows him or has interacted with him, and he goes beyond just causal loop diagrams, and he builds working system dynamics models of the archetypes and invents new archetypes and what have you. So he goes way beyond Peter Senge's book or what's done here. But these are the well-known ones. And I have these boxes here because whenever I made this slide, I thought, well, for an activity in class, I could have students fill in, it's resources to A. That's a generic idea, resources to B. So there's two competing demands for a resource: people, money, time, right? And then the more resources A gets, the more success they're going to have. And then the more B gets, the more B will have. And so if it's a zero-sum game. If I get more, you get less, and vice versa. So it's successful to the successful. There's two competing positive loops. So can you think of real-life examples of the resources to A, resources to B, and then write them in the box? So that's why I had them in the box. I think Peter's book or the Fifth Discipline workbook, there's a workbook. I think it's called the workbook. I don't remember. It does this, right? So we don't have to go through these here and now, but there's the successful limits to growth, competing limits to growth, tragedy of the commons, growth and underinvestment with eroding goals, accidental adversaries, fixes that fail, shifting the burden. So if you look at the characteristics of complex systems as principles of actual systems, a lot of these are literally listed by Forrester there. So maybe these should be at the top under principles, not under generic structures in the middle of that hierarchy. So shifting the burden, eroding goals, escalation, and whatever. So, in this class, we're not going to study all of these things in isolation, but because it's more about building the models. But there has been an attempt, and I have the papers up there, to organize all these things. Okay, similar to how Heinz, okay, I gotta scroll through a lot of stuff here, sorry. So Heinz said, wow, there's all these molecules. Let me, first of all, reproduce them all, at least a large number of them, a well-known, useful number of them. And let me try and organize them so people can find them. Like I need to close the gap between what I want and what I got. Okay, so this is a screenshot, but in the software you can click and it'll take you right to, like I did with the assemblies, it'll take you right to the code. And you notice he color codes it so that, again, you can try and identify what's the appropriate molecule for my need, right? I need something to drain and go to zero, like something is depreciating away, plant equipment is depreciating away, or a drug is being dissipated from the human body, or alcohol is being dissipated from your bloodstream through your sweating and breathing and whatever. Or I need an action from a resource, whatever, right? So with the archetypes, I can't remember the guy's name, but we'll show you the paper in a minute. Same idea. Can we organize the archetypes? So if you have a problem, you can try and find the appropriate archetype that might guide your model. Okay, so I'm most concerned about growth or fixing a problem. Okay, and then you start on your journey to the most likely archetype that would assist you in conceptualizing the model. Okay. Everybody following all this? Because it's not the most elegant presentation I've ever done, but I'm hoping everybody's getting what because some of this is in process. I don't know if the archetypes really should be at the top level of principles. Okay, but maybe they should. I don't know. Okay. So let's get out of here. I keep flashing by something that looks interesting, isn't it? Hopefully we'll get to it. All right. So let's just go through a couple of quick peeks here at some things to sort of tie this down. So I think it's Braun is the person who did the thing I just showed you, the archetypes trying to organize them. So he gives you more information about the archetypes. I think if we scroll all the way down here, if I remember, memory serves. So he's telling you when you use them and, and what their advantages are and disadvantages. Oh man, there's a lot of these things. Oh man. There we go. Finally. So then this is the thing I just showed you. I'm most concerned about growth or fixing problems. So he tries to organize them. Okay. Now, what I don't like and what Forrester never liked is notice he presents the dynamics of this structure. And Jay would always say there is no way possible to know the dynamics of a system from a causal loop diagram. Because we talked today in the seminar about, well, we used AI to try and find a social fabric matrix and then find the causal loop diagram and, and all that stuff. And it's good for conceptualization. We're looking for feedback loops. We're looking for important variables. How do we organize that information? Social fabric matrix. Can AI help us? Blah, 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 all that stuff. But you can't let's say you do all that successfully, you cannot determine the dynamics of a system without stocks and flows and equations and simulation. So when this guy does this, that's sketchy. He says, oh, this is going to obviously do this. No, that's not obvious. So that's where people who do systems thinking and draw causal loop diagrams, but never learn how to build models are dangerous because they'll build these contraptions that are very gargantuan and they'll start telling somebody they know how it behaves. And you can't do that. You really need to learn how to formally build the models. But at any rate, this Braun guy is the one who came up with this particular, I don't know this person, this particular way of identifying or organizing the archetypes. Okay. And there's some other stuff about, predicting behavior using archetypes. Okay. Not saying the archetypes give you no idea about behavior, but you just can't know for sure. So we want to be a little bit thoughtful about using any of these tools. Okay. So what about David Lane? I think this was the paper. He's written about generic structures, and let's see if we can read a little bit of what David has to say. He's an interesting guy, David. He went to Oxford, so he's very much an Oxford Englishman. Nice guy. I always get a Christmas card from him every year, and I send him one. But at any rate, what does he say? From its inception, a clear aspiration of the field of SD was to offer an integrative theory of the separate processes of management, which would make it possible to evaluate and reinterpret specific cases and experiences, so producing generalizable insights. In the last 3 to 4 decades, the creation and evolution of generic structures as vehicles for storing and applying these insights has been one of the ways in which this aspiration has advanced. Despite the important role that generic structures are seen to have within system dynamics, there's no agreed upon or even precise definition. And he talks about Mark Page's paper I mentioned was in the first issue of the SD Review. He offers as a tentative working definition that generic structures are dynamic feedback systems that support particular but widely applicable behavioral insights. Senge, there's Peter, suggests that generic structures are relatively simple models of dynamic processes that recur in diverse settings and that embody important management principles. So a lot of these people are, coming from the business school point of view. However, generic structures also appear to be closely related to several other concepts in SD, which we might list. They are linked with generic models, case studies converted to explicit dynamic form, or self-contained behavioral theories. Okay. The literature also speaks of elementary structures, simple feedback processes, and what have you. So here we go. This is what I was looking for. On a markedly less serious note, at the 1983 System Dynamics Conference in Cancun, Mexico, I was there, and we held most of our meetings waist deep in water at the beach. It was the best set of boring meetings I was ever at. The water was perfectly clear and all that. John Sterman confessed to a profound uncertainty in defining generic structures, but associated them with the U.S. definition of pornography. I know one when I see one. And then he gives his British view. Here's the point, such uncertainty cannot be healthy for a term that is used so frequently by our professional community and which has recently become very popular with a wider audience. This is people who do systems thinking. They read Senge's book and whatever. Does the label generic structure make sense if it is so poorly defined? Is the pursuit of generic structures a snark hunt, the essential triviality of the endeavor obfuscated by the confusing variety of definitions? Okay, so he's basically saying, not good not to be able to precisely say what the heck one of these things are, but as like Sterman was saying, well, I know when I see one and they're useful. All right. Anything else here to point out? These are famous papers. So you might say, oh, Radzicki's reading to what you got to know. These are well-known papers. Now, here's where Suleiman and Alex Smith, one of Suleiman's committee members, and I were getting him to do for his doctoral dissertation, begin making new molecules from behavioral economics, right? So I won't going to go through that now, but you can take a look at that paper. Okay. Okay. All right. So I'm trying to remember if I was going to show you anything else. So at this point, let's pump the brakes a little bit and say questions, because I gave you a lot of stuff here. We're not splitting the atom here, but still it was a lot of about generic structures, right? Archetypes, molecules, assemblies, atoms, and where they rank in this hierarchy. You might say, who the hell cares where they rank in the hierarchy? But if they're at the top, then are we talking about principles of real systems, principles of modeling, or principles outlining the relationship between structure and behavior, right? So again, got to be a little familiar. If you're going to play in the sandbox with professional system dynamicists from around the world, they're going to be throwing stuff like this at you, particularly if you present a paper in front of them, right? You got to be able to handle or at least understand what they're asking you if they're throwing these terms around, right? So questions, or is it more or less clear? Maybe not.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Mine is more so the definition of or what an archetype is. Like, how would you define an archetype?
Yeah, Peter Senge said it was from his book that they became popular, that it's some relatively simple models that appear again and again and again. Simple formulations that appear again and again. I think it's across domain areas. It doesn't have to all be in one domain area, right? So, and people, what you'll see is even amongst our graduate students, Tim Clancy's a big one. We heard about today at the seminar. We heard about Tim Clancy and Rafat Zaini, two of our PhD graduates, who at the recent SD conference in Norway in July presented a paper where they were kind of looking at the ethics of Forrester's urban dynamics stuff, right? Well, particularly Tim, Rafat a little bit, but Tim always throws up archetypes all the time. Jim Hockenda, who isn't here because he's at his son's wedding engagement party rehearsal thing or whatever, will frequently throw up archetypes. Oh, that's the fix of that fail archetype. So you got, again, if you're going to communicate and hang around with and present at and whatever system dynamics conferences and these people are going to be saying this, using these phrases, and you want to be familiar with what they're referring to, right? Yeah, Neja, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just wondering if it's like a stylistic difference in vocabulary. When Dr. Saeed, he has the paper that he refers to a lot on managerial role playing and decision making.
Okay.
Is that sort of like the same? Because he doesn't seem to use the structure. He doesn't seem to use archetypes or molecules like that. He does refer to like first order, second order systems and that, but I feel like maybe maybe the managerial role playing stuff is kind of his version of archetypes and assemblies.
You really have to ask him. What I can tell you is one time Khaled, and by the way, I met Khaled in 1983. So how many years have I known the guy? 41? Known him a long time. He one time said to me, I vividly remember, that he found that he can model most anything. There's a few exceptions, but he can model most anything with a basic molecule set, that you don't have to design all sorts of exotic formulations to model most things. Okay, now you'd have to, I'm pretty sure he told me that. I kind of in my mind's eye remember him saying that. And I don't know that he ever uses the phrases, archetypes, or whatever, but he certainly uses the molecules and so forth. And if you look at his models, you should begin to see these molecules again and again, right? The Lego pieces where he just assembles them in particular ways. But you'd have to really ask him, because that's actually a good question. Jay never really used those phrases, but he would say a good system dynamics model is a general instance of a family of specific cases. So he built his urban dynamics model from Boston, but he didn't call it the Boston dynamics model. He called it urban. And he said it should be able to be parameterized for different cities, right? And he said that's a mark of a good, in his mind, system dynamics model. Okay, so there's not an elegant. I mean, that's why Mark Page and David Lane are writing journal articles about this, because there's not an agreed upon definition of all these things, even though the terms are used widely among system dynamicists. Now, having said that, okay, there's this confusion. Should it be at the real type level or should it be at the principles level and blah, blah, blah. In some sense, who cares? Now let's just start looking at whatever we're going to call them and start learning how we can use them to build models. And where they fit in this hierarchy of inductive logic and all this, who cares in some sense. But I did want to make sure everybody's aware of this issue, right? Couple other, go ahead, Nejla.
Oh, I'm just curious. I mean, I can definitely see how the archetypes could be thought of as typologies, and structures and assemblies, but I am not seeing how they could be thought of as principles.
So if you remember the characteristics of complex systems, right? So these are principles of actual systems that Jay defined. Some of them are archetypes. So that doesn't mean Jay was always right, although he seemed to always be right. But in his mind, at least, is interpreting his work, that's where he placed them, very high up. But
so that means
I don't know.
Like,
I'm not drawing a line in the sand. I don't know if.
I mean, the question is, are we putting it in the inductive or deductive category? Is that
No, I think it's
Those are like
it's,
inductive or-
you got your pattern model, then you
Yeah.
got your real types, and then you got your principles. And I'm saying the archetypes are here or here, and I'm not sure where. Because
And
some of the
what are principles?
archetypes are at the highest level in Jay's way of organizing things.
So, but wouldn't principles be deductive reasoning, not inductive?
No, it's not. Well, there's a feedback loop, right? Because I said you work your way
Mhm.
up from the
you
patterns to the
assign
principles,
your-
but then the principles guide.
That's the whole point is to.
So, but that's not quite the same thing
Deductive.
as Descartes' logical positivism and all that. So, but past what I'm telling you, you got to get a philosopher in here to do philosophy of science. So, because it's way more complicated. It's epistemology and ontology and all the stuff the philosophers get into.
Mhm.
So, and again, I don't know that it really matters if we're talking about how do I build a model, and I don't really care about Radzicki's goofy diagrams. Other than I want to be aware that these terms are used in the profession, and I want to be able to understand when somebody's coming at me with these things, like I'm delivering a paper at the SD conference and somebody's hand goes up in the audience and they start talking about an archetype or something, like, do you know what they're even talking about, right? So you want to be able to field questions like that, right? And then become, whether they're here or here in the hierarchy, you want to become familiar with them so that you can use them to help you build a model, right? So that's in some sense the bottom line. So I maybe have muddied the water too much by going through this, because in some sense, if all I want to do is learn how to build models, who cares? Okay.
Yeah, I think from reading the fifth discipline, in some sense, I could understand what Peter meant by the archetypes, but later in interacting with other SD materials, I'm like, I have no idea what archetypes are. And so maybe I'm just thinking it's probably you can understand what someone means by archetype by the context in which they are speaking. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be contextual. That's a good point. Yeah, 100%. One interesting story. There is a paper by George Richardson and some of his students. They did for a graduate student class or seminar or something. They said, hey, let's take the archetypes and see if we could cause a loop diagram archetype. Let's see if we can build working models from them. And there is a paper where they presented it and they came up with some working models. Now, whether it's the archetype or one of many possible working models of an archetype is, I think, an open question. But the story is, we were in Japan for the SD conference, Tokyo, and George gets up and he's presenting this paper, and then he tells a sidebar. He was actually kind of angry. I don't know if he was like faux angry to make it dramatic or if he was really angry. I think he was really angry. But what happened was, at the time they were doing this, something called deterministic chaos was a big deal. It was starting to show up in all different areas of science, physics, and what have you. The Santa Fe Institute, if you ever heard of that, was kind of created because of chaos theory. The Mandelbrot set, if you've ever heard of that, the Lorentz attractor, the Rosler attractor, issues related to prediction in economics. Can you even without a perfect model, can you even predict anything? The butterfly effect, which was a model starring Ashton Kutcher. There was a movie with Jason Statham, the English actor, called Chaos Theory, I think. So it was like a big hot thing, right? So when George and his students were building these models of the archetypes, it looked like they had discovered a new, strange, chaotic attractor. So is everybody familiar with the Lorentz attractor? This goofy thing that oscillates around and never repeats. It kind of looks like a butterfly, although that's not what.
Is an image on the homepage in our course.
Oh, yes, right, exactly right. Or that's a Roessler. Oh, wait, maybe I have, am I sharing my, no, I'm not sharing. I think it's my, what do you call the wallpaper on my computer? My laptop computer. But at any rate, George thought he might have discovered a strange attractor. There's the Lorenz attractor and the Roessler attractor. There's going to be a Richardson attractor. And so he's telling, because he's presenting the archetypes, and then he starts telling the story that on whichever one, I forget which one it was. There was one of them, they thought in building it, they thought they had discovered a strange attractor. And then one of the graduate students said, Professor Richardson, did you check off the box that says the non-negative box? So let me show you real quick here. If we go to Stella over here, you see the stocks here, non-negative stock. Does everybody see that? Non-negative stock. I'm assuming everybody can see that. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, so good. So originally in Stella, there wasn't this option, non-negative stock. That didn't exist. It was just stock. But the default setting on the stock was non-negative, which meant if you just had a stock and an outflow, okay, no first order control over here. So you just had this flow here draining the thing. It would never go to zero. Even, excuse me, it would never go negative. It would stop at zero. Even if your equation here said, just keep sucking stuff out of here, no matter what. And the reason was when Barry Richmond, the guy who created Stella, would use this for consulting, and he would leave the model with his clients and say, I'll be back in a week. They would start playing around, and they didn't know how to put first order control in. And then this thing would go negative. It would be like negative people or something. And they'd be furious. And they'd be calling him and emailing him and hassling him. And he finally said, enough already. So he made that the default that the stocks couldn't go below zero by default. And if you wanted them to be normal stocks, and then you added the right equations, you had to proactively do that. The problem was George didn't realize that that he didn't uncheck that box. So he created this nonlinearity, it's abrupt nonlinearity where the stock couldn't go below zero, and it created what looked like a strange attractor. And then when they clicked it off, like it was supposed to be off, it disappeared. So he thinks he's going to be in the annals of history in mathematics history for this new thing. And then it turns out it was, so he was like, Barry, you should, he's going to on stage in Tokyo, so you should take that out of your software. It sucks. And what have you. Anyway, so that's an archetype story. All right. So, so if we're all comfortable with the notion of more or less comfortable, atoms, molecules, assemblies, archetypes, generic structures, we kind of get it. And there's this classification issue, and we're familiar with the terms in case anybody ever lays them on our doorstep. The next step is to begin learning molecules, generic structures, and whatever, becoming acquainted with a set of these, right? Because then later in the course, we're going to start building a model, and you'll see we're going to be using these things. Okay? Yes? All right, fair enough. So let's see if we can share again. And we'll go, not here. We'll go over here. So information and material delays. Okay, that's the next section. We're going to spend a whole bunch of time here. These are going to be our first new set of generic structures. Okay, what happened here? We got to find the right one. Okay. So before I do this, let's just talk a little bit. So one of the big important ideas in system dynamics modeling is that there are significant delays in systems. Just because you want something and can afford it in terms of time, people, money, whatever, doesn't mean you can have it right away. So Ashley's in the Air Force. You have I don't know what you call it, quartermaster corps, airlift or whatever, like you got to get your supplies to your people, right? If they're running low on something, and they order more, it doesn't arrive instantly, right? So you got to plan for delays, right? And
Yeah,
that,
when I was at Dover, I worked with the C5s and C17s, and they were built in the 80s, so they break a lot. A lot of delays.
yeah, right, yeah. Then they bring all this stuff, right? So there are significant delays in communication. Takes a while for the message to get from here to here, whatever, right? So delays in systems are super, super, super important to understanding what's going on, why a behavior is counterintuitive, why systems oscillate, and whatever. So let's, like, big gold star, delays are important. We must know how to model them and represent them and use them and whatever, okay? All right. Oh, by the way, real quick, can anybody tell me how you represent a delay in a causal loop diagram? So if we're gonna just some of these things are, I want to ping you guys, because sometimes I know we covered it, but
Is having a dash through the arrow.
right, okay, good. So variable 1, hang on real quick here. So now I'm in the causal loop diagram area here. Variable 1, variable 2. And so we're just drawing a causal loop diagram here. Can't simulate this thing, right? But if I want to show a delay between variable 1 and variable 2, so a change in variable 1 causes a change in variable 2, right? I can say, put a delay mark in here, and there's that double slash, right? Indicating there's a significant delay between cause and effect. Can't simulate it, so you can't see the delay, but if you're mapping this out, or you're using the social fabric matrix to get a causal whatever, and you say, but there's a big delay here and it's important. Delays are important, super important. You put the slashes through there. Some people will make this a box because stocks create delays, right? So sometimes they'll represent it with, instead of 2 slashes, with a box. Some people will make a box and say delay in it, in their causal loop diagram. So what are you gonna do? There's different ways to do it. Okay, so so delays are very important. Guess what? There's 2 different kinds of delays that we want to learn to use in system dynamics modeling. There's material delays over here, and there's information delays. So we're either delaying information or we're delaying the movement of material movement, people, money, machines, real items. That's the way to think about it. Okay, so there's 2 kinds: material delays and information delays. Okay, and then within the arena of each of these categories of delays, there are different types. So we have a lot of delay stuff going on here. So go ahead, Najla. Yep.
Would human perceptions be considered information or material?
Information. Yeah. So we would normally model human perceptions of something as a first order information delay. So it's in the information delay bucket, and then we have inside of that bucket different types of delay structures. Okay.
So like human intuition, feelings, all that stuff
Mm-hmm.
is information.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, and so herein lies why we've been trying to get the psych people to work with us, The folks who, so first of all, in our department, there's kind of two groups of, three groups of psych people. The one group is the behavioral economists. It's really only one. It's Alex. Maybe we're going to throw Suleiman in there now. And they're economists who do psych stuff. And then there's the psych people who do psych stuff. And then there's the learning science people who do psych stuff. And they do a lot of the same things, but then they disagree about certain things or emphasize different things. So what we need in system dynamics is two different groups to help us. We need people to help us write better equations that capture the kinds of things Nejla just mentioned: emotions, perceptions, altruism, risk assessment, biases. What do the behavioral economists or psych people or psych people know about what people do cognitively when they assess risk or whatever, right? And not only how do they know it? Well, they run human beings through controlled experiments again and again, and they identify what people do, right? So we need them to help us write better equations. And then when we build our games, our learning environments, our flight simulators, we want to be able to determine scientifically whether or not people actually learn in our learning environments. Pilots train in simulators. Humans should train, or social systems decision makers should train similarly in a simulator. Well, okay, we put them in there and they're moving sliders and buttons and playing the game. Are they actually learning anything? Or are they learning the wrong stuff? Are they learning what they're supposed to learn? How do you do that? Well, that's learning science, right? And we have all these people in our department, so we're always trying to get them interested in working with us and helping us to do the psychological stuff. But part of it is representing accurately in a way they would say, check, that's okay. They would sign off on it. That's legit. Perceptions, emotions, altruism, all this stuff, right? So that's like a cutting edge research area in my opinion, for system dynamics. Okay. All right. So we have information delays and material delays. So, if something's delayed, what sandbox am I in? Then once I determine I'm either in the information or the material delays, now there's different delay structures and which one is appropriate. Okay. So I'm looking at my clock. We got some time. Okay. So let's proceed. Okay. So let's look at material delays first. So everybody should be able to see that. So now we've got 4 different stock flow feedback loop structures, and we can directly compare these things. Okay. So the purpose here is to compare and contrast. Okay. So I have a situation in which I just programmed this up right before class. So I'm still sort of tweaking it, I guess, but so I know there's a delay between cause and effect. Is it a material or information delay? Material delay. Okay. Now, do I have a first order delay, a third order delay, a boxcar delay, or an nth order delay? That's the next question I have to ask. Okay. So what we're delaying is the inflow is delayed before it becomes an outflow. Stocks create delays. Okay. So notice over here, at the risk of stating the obvious, this inflow only has to go through one stock, one delay structure before it becomes an outflow. Whereas down here, it has to go through 3 stocks before it's kicked out, right? Over here, we're going to use a canned function, and it's going to go through, this inflow is going to go through n stocks. You can make n any number you want, 55 stocks if you want, doesn't matter. That's called the order of the delay. By default, I have it set to 12. So basically, this structure here is as though I chained together 12 stocks. I didn't because I used a canned function, but mathematically behind the scenes, it's as though I built this structure down here, but there's 12 stocks in there. If I made this, 55, a 55th order delay, there would be down here, instead of 3, there'd be 55 stocks. Go ahead and lay them all out. I'm going to go have lunch while you do that. It's a lot of stocks, right? So that's why, we have these canned functions here. When you get past, let's say 1 or 3, do you really want to lay it out, by hand? Yeah, Nasia, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that the nth order delay reminds me of when I worked in major organizations in the comms department, and
Mhm.
an email had to go through a chain of sometimes 15 to 20 people.
Yeah.
And each of those people have a backlog of emails to read and approve. And then of course, as you know from your model on organizational edits and revisions, they get sent back to previous people. And I mean, it was a mess. Sometimes that was, the major, I would say, system problems at some of the places where I've been, is that they literally could not put out any official communication because it could just never make it through the approvals process. But that reminds me of an nth order, because each person is a stock. Each person that has to approve that same email is a stock, I think.
Yeah, sounds like
Each
work.
desk.
Sounds like work day at WPI when something has to be approved by all these people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, if you were going to model that, so right, 100%. Okay. So we push on. So if I were, so what I did here, see, there's a normal inflow rate here. What did I say? It's 100 units of something. This is generic. It's a model of nothing. I don't know, whatever it is. 100 units of something are inflowing to all 4 of these structures. It's the same inflow, so we can compare. Okay. Then over here, I have test inputs. Okay. Yeah. Now what's going on? Anybody tell me? I mean, I will tell you, but before I tell you, does anybody know what I'm doing here? These are test inputs, right? So remember the first course, my first course, right? Homework 6 or whatever it was. We took the 3 molecules, right? And we looked at them without feedback, then with feedback. And the third one, the first order negative loop with an explicit goal, actual orders, expected orders. And we started using test inputs, right? Does anybody remember that?
What was the context of the model?
So it was the homework where you had, I don't remember if I used ADDX. I think it was ADDX because it was for the heroin model. It was ADDX and new ADDX. And then ADDX make new ADDX, or population make a new population. But what if the population is 0? It's still making babies. That doesn't make sense. How do you fix it? Feedback. Remember that? I can pull it. Do you want to see it? Let's refresh your memory, because this is very common where people, I know you know it, but when you learned it, you weren't ready to hear it. You were hearing the words, that was fine, right? But it wasn't resonating yet because you weren't ready to hear it. So what do we have here? I think it was 6, going from memory here. Yeah. No, sorry. Not 6.
Yeah, that said heroin related model.
Yeah, but I don't think it was. No, it's, might be 7 then. I can't, these things change all the time. I can't remember. Yeah, this is the one. Okay, so we started with this, right? And then we said, what if the initial value here is 0? It still makes new addicts because the addicts convince other addicts to join them, right? But what if there's no addicts? People just on their own become, or this is population, this is babies. You need at least 2 to make new ones. Well, what if the software will do it, but it makes no sense if this initial value is 0. What's missing? Feedback. And that's molecule number 1 with doubling time and all that, right? Then we did the same thing for an outflow. And again, if you just have an exogenous outflow here, this will go negative. Unless you have Barry's stupid no negative stocks, non-negative stocks. What's the solution? Feedback. First order control, right? But then here's the point. We went to this one with the expected order rate and the actual order rate. And we started using test inputs, right? To knock it out of equilibrium. A step, a pulse, sine wave, oscillation, noise, a ramp, right? Remember that? And then we started putting it all together to build bigger models, right? I don't know if you remember that, but so what I'm getting at is we use test inputs in system dynamics, right? What we do is we put a model, whether it's a piece of a model or an entire model, but certainly a piece when we're building a model, into equilibrium. And then we exogenously knock it out with a test input and we see what happens, right? Because in equilibrium, everything is a horizontal line over time, right? Very uninteresting. But if you knock it out with an external shock, whatever is no longer a horizontal line must be the system processing the shock or responding to the shock. So you can clearly see how the model is reacting to a particular external shock. And you're asking yourself, does this make sense? Is it doing something stupid? Or just going negative and it shouldn't go negative people or something? Well, that wouldn't make any sense. Or it has steady state error, or it has a variety of problems. You're trying to uncover how a piece of structure is doing, how a generic structure is behaving before you go and attach it to another piece of structure and make a bigger model. Because if you never test, right, and just put stuff together, let's say you're just stringing molecules together left and right and up and down and archetypes and generics, and then you hit the go button and the model is behaving all crazy, you have no idea why, right? So before you hook up pieces of structure together, molecules together, assemblies together, you want to test them in isolation with test inputs. You start them in equilibrium where everything's a horizontal line, and then you shock it out with a step, a pulse, noise, ramp, a sine wave, whatever, different test inputs. And then you should be saying to yourself, here's what should happen if the piece of structure is behaving correctly. And I look to see, is it doing that? Or is it doing something dumb? Right? Remember that? Is that ringing a bell? I can't tell if there's any bells ringing.
I think
I'm
so,
hearing
yeah.
thumbs up. Okay. So even if you're not quite remembering it, is that what I just said? Is that resonating? Is that like, yeah, I get that. That's a good idea. Before we hook this thing up to this thing and make a bigger thing, let's test each one in isolation and make sure they're not doing anything dumb, right? How do we test them? Well, the signature way, there's other ways you can solve them analytically and stuff, but the signature way is to use test inputs, step, pulse, noise, ramp, and so forth, right? So what I have here is I have all sorts of test inputs in one, I guess you'd say, molecule, right? A better way to do this, I was lazy today, is to see how I got zeros and ones here, turning stuff on and off. I could have switches out here where, you know, over here where you can just, you don't have to go inside here and try and select this number 1 here precisely and make it a 0 and all that. There's a more elegant way to do it, right? Or you can make it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you just pick a number, and then there's Boolean logic, you know, if in here that says something like if switch equals 3, then, you know, the pulse function turns on, whatever. There's different ways to do it. If I had more time today, I would have done it more elegantly, but everybody sees that there's test inputs going on here, like that exercise from the first course, right? Does Colin have you do this in 551? Because he doesn't like to start his models in equilibrium typically.
I think he tends to want us to start the modules in equilibrium and then connect the modules. So I'd say yes.
Oh, he does. Okay, good. Jay often did not start them in equilibrium and shock them out. So
I have a question about that. So when SD modelers, when we say equilibrium and we say start the model in equilibrium and then shock it out, is this the same equilibrium that like economists talk about when they say like actually, you know, heterodox economists will criticize like neoclassical or orthodox economists and say like, actually, there are no equilibriums in our economic system because that's not how social systems work. It's never in equilibrium. It's constantly in flux. And therefore, that's why these very basic, you know, linear and quadratic type equations are insufficient. Is that the same? Is that the same? And if so, like why then?
So,
if this
yeah,
is
so
why are we using equilibrium?
So it is the same, but almost always, at least in undergraduate economics, and even in a lot of graduate economics, static models are used, timeless models. So there's a static equilibrium. We're talking a dynamic equilibrium, but yes, they are with that caveat, they are the same. Now, there's a big difference from neoclassical economics that says there's an equilibrium here, and then the model moves to an equilibrium here. And market's always clear.
Right.
Okay.
Versus
we put our model into equilibrium, or a piece of our model into equilibrium, so we can shock it out and observe its behavior in an easy way. As opposed to it's doing whatever, and then you shock it, and it's doing whatever, and then it's doing whatever. And you're like, well, what would have it done anyway versus how is it responding to the shock? You can't disentangle that. But if it's a horizontal line and then you shock it, anything that's not a horizontal line must be the response to the shock. So it helps you diagnose, is your model or your piece of your model correct or not? But that's very different than saying, you know, market's always clear, you know, their markets are stable, you know, and all the stuff that the neoclassical paradigm posits.
I see. So it's the difference between saying you're using equilibrium as a modeling tool for testing your model, as opposed to saying you actually think that's how the world works.
Correct. 100% correct. Yes.
And then just a quick related question, like then what if you have things in your model that have like stochastic relationships? How can you put it into equilibrium if you can't?
Well, you would leave it the noise off.
So that's considered
And put it
noise?
into equilibrium. And then when you say, okay, I've tested my piece of structure here, my generic structure, my molecule, whatever, bigger model, whatever, in a deterministic fashion with a single shock, a step, a pulse, whatever. Now let's test it with noise, and let's start it until period 5 or whatever, it doesn't matter, in equilibrium. And now let's turn the noise on and let's see how it responds to the stochastic input. And again, you're asking, what is whatever happening that's not a horizontal line, does it make sense? You'll find, for example, very common, a classic result in system dynamics, is that a model is oscillating. The beer game. And a lot of people will think it's because the deck of cards, the exogenous shock, is oscillating. That's why my corporate model is oscillating. The external environment is doing it to me. No, you'll find that you can have a model in equilibrium and then you just turn on the noise. It's just, 100 orders for widgets plus or minus a random variate between, 0 and or negative 20 and 20. So 100 plus a random variate that can vary between minus 20 and 20. So your orders are they're not doing some crazy thing. They're just, And
Yeah,
you'll see
and
the
because of
model,
that and
the model begins to
perception
oscillate.
delays. The perception delays create the oscillation because they overestimate how much the next one is going to change based on how much this one changed, right?
So, well, in the beer game, but the generic point is that the system in that example is designed to oscillate, and the noise just releases its natural behavior, which is oscillation in this example. It's not an external oscillation that's driving the oscillation of the model and causing it. No, it's the noise simply releases the natural behavior of the system that's due to its design. It's stock, flow, feedback loop, limiting factor design. Now, it might not be consciously designed to oscillate. Certain systems are. The human heart, I don't want my heartbeat to be like this. I want my
Right,
heartbeat to be
sound
like
waves,
this.
I'm guessing sound waves must have a similar structure.
Yeah, or an aircraft, when you ever look outside on a plane, on a flight, the wing is doing that. It's supposed to do that, right? So some systems are designed to oscillate, others not. But so sometimes it's a conscious decision to design the system to oscillate for whatever reason, pendulum clock, whatever. And other times you don't like that. You don't like your labor force going up and down or whatever, or overtime, undertime, overtime. But it's not being caused by your customers having a freaky order pattern. No, you can show just with noise, the system naturally wants to oscillate based on how it's designed. Even if it wasn't consciously designed, that's what you got. Think of the US tax code. No one in their right mind would design the US tax system from scratch the way it is. It's crazy. It's evolved to its present, or the US healthcare system, it's evolved to the way nobody would design it that way from scratch, but it is what it is. It got there from politics and who knows what over the years, but the design of the system, whether conscious or not, causes its behavior, right?
I never thought of all these institutions as something that is, I guess, that's what makes it a complex system, I guess, is that it's self-organizing. And so it is evolving. It's not, because I just think, oh, well, policymakers designed, but then you're right. Over time, they inherit what they got from their predecessor. So they didn't really design it because they can't just change and start over from scratch.
100%.
Yeah, you're right. So it really is evolution.
Okay, so I'm looking at the clock. I've been ranting at you guys all day, including earlier today. Yuck, wants to hear me ranting so much. So let's leave it here. We covered the whole generic structure thing. There was a lot of mishmash there, but I wanted to make sure doctoral students who are going to interact with other professional systems, even at our Thursday noon seminar, we'll probably be inviting some SD people, and they're going to probably be throwing this stuff around, and you want to be familiar with the stuff. But now we're starting to model. Now we're starting to look at structures. And then once we go through a whole catalog of structures you haven't seen before, generic structures, molecules, then we're going to start building a model, right? And you're going to be asked to go home and figure it out. And then the next week, I'll show you what I did. So we're leaving off at delays, material information. We got the basic idea, and there's different types, different orders of delays, and you use them under different circumstances. Okay, so we'll start. That's where we'll start next week. Okay. That's I think a
That's
good
good.
enough place. Okay, any last questions or what have you before we adjourn?
Not for
Go have
me.
dinner. Okay, very good. Well, good to see everybody. Thank you for participating. Hope you found some value, and we'll see you on campus or whatever, but we'll certainly see you next week.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
See you. Bye.